I stepped outside at dawn, steam rising from my mug. The air was still cool, carrying that particular silence that comes before the world wakes up. Then I saw it, heavy machinery sitting in the middle of my family's land, not beside it, in it. Black exhaust curling into the morning sky, treads carved deep through soil that had been undisturbed for half a century. There was a worker at the controls, eyes fixed deliberately forward. He knew I was there, he just wasn't acknowledging it. I walked directly to the woman holding the clipboard. She wore the expression of someone who'd done this before and expected a predictable outcome. "You need to remove that equipment now." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Brennan, you'll want to review Section 9 before making demands you can't enforce." I'd never seen any Section 9. She was fully aware of that. "You have 60 hours to cooperate. After that, we proceed with or without your input." I looked at the machine, at her, at the oak my grandfather planted the year I was born, still standing for now. "Understood," I said. She thought that meant surrender. It meant I'd just begun documenting everything. What would you have done in that moment? My name is Michael Brennan, and I'm not someone who looks for conflict. I mention that up front because by the end of this account you might question whether that's true. I was raised on this property, 38 acres in the foothills of western North Carolina, far enough from anything to feel remote, close enough to a county road to stay connected. My grandfather, Thomas Brennan, purchased it in 1961 on a machinist's wages and a loan he kept quiet until it was satisfied. He spent 2 decades transforming difficult terrain into productive land, a working orchard that eventually supplied local markets, a roadside stand, and enough preserved goods to gift every neighbor within 5 miles each winter without fail. My father maintained it. I took over when he couldn't anymore. The trees were mature, healthy, and rooted in ways that take generations to establish and less than an hour to destroy with industrial equipment. Here's what changed everything. About 7 years before this morning, a developer named Preston Mercer acquired the high ground directly above my land, 220 acres. He wasn't local. He came from Charlotte, wore performance fabric in inappropriate weather, drove a vehicle that never seemed to collect dirt, and he had visions. He constructed a planned residential community up there, 58 homes, a recreation center, what he called lifestyle infrastructure, which translated to amenities that looked better in brochures than in practice. The community was named Oakmont Heights, and it came with a homeowners association. The HOA was led by a woman named Patricia Dalton. Patricia deserves specific attention. She was 59, retired from middle management at a regional insurance firm, and she'd arrived at Oakmont Heights with the focused energy of someone who'd finally found a domain worthy of her organizational skills. She wore an identification badge on a lanyard even at informal gatherings. She'd requested the county resurvey her property boundaries 4 times in 3 years, twice at public expense, because she'd filed them as corrections to public records. She'd blocked a utility upgrade because the temporary equipment staging area would encroach 8 inches into the HOA's recorded right-of-way. She was, in the most technical sense, exactly the type of person the HOA structure was designed to empower, which is precisely why she shouldn't have had that power. My first encounter with Patricia came about 9 months before the equipment appeared. She arrived one afternoon in late autumn when the air carried the scent of fallen fruit beginning to ferment, insects hovering in lazy patterns, gravel crunching under her deliberate footsteps. She informed me, with practiced courtesy, that Oakmont Heights had identified a water management concern requiring a drainage corridor through the lower section of my property. She had documentation, she had diagrams, she had colored markers. I told her I'd review it. She thanked me for my cooperation. I hadn't offered cooperation. I'd offered to look at paperwork. I should have examined that documentation immediately. I should have contacted an attorney that same week. Instead, I set it on my kitchen counter beneath a coffee cup and returned to seasonal maintenance. That decision cost me 9 trees and approximately 20 months of my life. But it also initiated the most carefully planned response I've ever executed. Let me explain the letter's argument, because understanding Patricia's method is essential. The letter claimed Oakmont Heights had commissioned a water management study, which was true. They'd hired a civil engineering firm from Asheville. The study allegedly identified my lower acreage as the natural drainage path for the ridge. The letter further claimed that under North Carolina common law governing surface water, downstream property owners must accept water that naturally flows from uphill properties. That legal principle exists. North Carolina does recognize natural drainage rights. Here's the critical distinction. It applies to drainage patterns that already exist naturally, not to engineered channels being proposed for the first time. There's a fundamental difference between water that flows downhill on its own and water that a developer has regraded an entire hillside to redirect. Patricia's letter treated those as fundamental concepts. I still didn't contact an attorney. Instead, I drafted a response, polite, professional, requesting the complete engineering study, the specific legal authority they were citing, and any survey documents establishing easement rights over my land. Standard due diligence, the kind of letter that takes careful thought and clearly communicates you understand the process. Her response arrived 13 days later and demonstrated bureaucratic escalation at its finest. She hadn't provided the engineering study. She hadn't cited specific statutory authority. What she provided was a letter from the county's water management office signed by an assistant director named Robert Hayes, stating the drainage project aligned with county development standards and adjacent property owners should anticipate accommodating necessary infrastructure improvements. That phrase, should anticipate accommodating, carries no legal weight. It is, however, exactly the kind of official-sounding language that most people read as authoritative instruction. Patricia understood that. She was counting on it. I called my neighbor Daniel Morrison that evening. Daniel is 71, a retired civil engineer, the kind of person who's maintained organized files since approximately 1985. He arrived with a thermos of coffee, the strong kind, and read both letters slowly at my kitchen table. "That assistant director's letter means nothing," Daniel said. "It's a courtesy communication, not authorization. You own this land. They cannot construct a channel through it without an easement, and they cannot obtain an easement without either purchasing it from you or acquiring it through eminent domain. A private HOA cannot initiate eminent domain." He was correct. That mattered. But here's what I didn't know yet. Patricia had already initiated a separate process entirely. While exchanging letters with me, she'd filed an application with the county to have my lower acreage designated as a water management facility under state code provisions allowing localities to require private landowners to maintain drainage infrastructure if it's part of a municipal water management plan. If that designation succeeded, everything changed. I discovered this 3 weeks later because my other neighbor, a woman named Ellen Sutherland who herbed herbs and kept bees and attended every county planning meeting out of genuine civic interest, called me on a Tuesday and said casually, "Michael, I see your property listed on next month's agenda." I drove to the county offices the following morning. I reviewed the application. I read it twice. For the first time in this entire situation, I felt genuine cold anger. Patricia had included aerial photographs of my property in her application, drone imagery showing the natural low point in my lower acreage. She'd annotated them with arrows and labels. She'd submitted a drainage analysis modeling the ridge's water flow as channeling through my land. More than that, in the application's narrative section, she'd described my orchard as an agricultural operation in decline with limited active management. She suggested the designation would have minimal impact on current land use. 37 apple trees in active production supplying 2 restaurants and 3 farmers markets, and she'd characterized it as declining. I read that phrase multiple times. Then I went home, contacted an attorney, and began taking detailed notes. The attorney's name was Marcus Webb. He'd practiced land use law in this county for 32 years and had the calm, methodical manner of someone who'd outlasted every opponent simply by knowing more and persisting longer. Marcus's first assessment was direct. The designation application is aggressive, but not baseless. They found a legitimate mechanism. If the county approves it, you lose without ever having the easement fight. His second assessment was more useful. But the application requires a public comment period. You have standing to challenge it. He pulled a county code manual from his shelf. There are specific conditions for designation they may not meet. North Carolina's water management facility designation requires that designated land not be active agricultural production unless the locality provides compensation or demonstrates no feasible alternative exists. Patricia had claimed my land wasn't active production. That claim was foundational to her application. If I could prove otherwise, loudly and publicly, the application collapsed. So I did something that felt slightly absurd but turned out to be exactly correct. I organized a harvest event. Not a small gathering. I printed announcements and distributed them at the feed store, the cafe, the library, the community center. I contacted the 2 restaurants I supplied and asked them to mention it. I reached out to the Regional Agricultural Bureau. I invited the local newspaper, the Henderson Valley Register, which, despite being modest in size, has solid readership among the county commission. 193 people attended on a Saturday in late November. The weather was cold and clear, with that particular quality of late autumn light that makes everything sharp and beautiful. Long shadows, golden grass, bare trees against slate sky. I had hot cider and samples of preserved goods. I had Daniel's wife, Helen, organizing a baking contest. I had a local string band performing near the barn. And I had, prominently displayed near the main table, a hand-lettered sign listing the orchard's current production statistics. 10,800 pounds of apples sold in the past 12 months, 2 restaurant accounts, 3 farmers market stalls, active agricultural operation since 1959. The reporter from the Register, a young journalist named Sarah Chen who proved to be exceptionally thorough, photographed that sign. She also interviewed me for 40 minutes, took extensive notes, photographed the trees, and asked me specifically what I thought about the HOA's drainage application. I told her calmly, specifically, with documentation. Her article ran the following Wednesday with the headline, "Historic Brennan Orchard Central to Disputed HOA Drainage Proposal." Patricia responded by contacting the newspaper to complain the coverage was biased and inflammatory. She sent a letter to the county planning office characterizing the harvest event as a publicity stunt. She submitted a supplemental memo to the planning application arguing that 1 year's production figures were insufficient to establish long-term land use character. That supplemental memo was a mistake, because it was public record, and it contained, buried in a footnote, a statement that would become important later. Oakmont Heights maintains its drainage proposal represents the only engineered solution to the identified water management problem. The only solution. Daniel read that footnote at my kitchen table and smiled for about 20 seconds straight. That's not true. It's not even close to true. There are at least 3 alternative approaches, and one is better than what she's proposing. Can you document that? I asked. He picked up his coffee. I spent 30 years documenting things. Get me graph paper. Daniel produced, over 3 weeks, a 37-page alternative drainage analysis. He worked in the study off his garage during evenings, using graph paper initially, then transferring to CAD software with assistance from his nephew who was studying civil engineering at NC State and apparently found the project genuinely interesting as practical coursework. The analysis identified 3 alternative drainage routes for Oakmont Heights water management, 2 routed through easements that could be acquired on the HOA's own adjacent undeveloped parcels, land they already controlled. 1 routed through county road right-of-way, which would require permits but no private land acquisition. None of these alternatives had been mentioned in Patricia's application, not one. She'd submitted a drainage analysis modeling only the route through my orchard, as if my property were the sole option, then claimed it was the only feasible solution. Marcus filed formal comments on the planning application, citing Daniel's analysis, our production records, and most importantly, a provision in the county's own water management ordinance requiring applicants to demonstrate no feasible alternative exists before designating private agricultural land. Patricia's application didn't just fail to meet that standard, it had actively concealed that alternatives existed. The planning department scheduled a public hearing. That hearing had standing room only. Daniel presented his analysis using a projector borrowed from the community center. Ellen testified about pollinator habitat and the orchard's role in local ecosystem health. 3 restaurant owners submitted written statements about the economic importance of local sourcing. A retired county commissioner named Arthur Simmons, who had known my grandfather and carried the kind of measured authority that comes from decades of public service, stood and said simply, "This application should never have been submitted in this form, and the board knows it." The planning board tabled the designation application pending review of feasible alternatives, by any measure, a victory. And I should have known that someone like Patricia Dalton doesn't accept a tabling as defeat. She accepts it as temporary delay. Because 2 months later, February, the ground frozen, the ridge above my property white and hard. I walked outside one morning and found the fence line along my lower acreage had been cut. Clean diagonal cuts on 7 posts. A work crew in orange vests was staking a line through my orchard with survey flags, moving efficiently, not acknowledging me. Their truck had Oakmont Heights HOA printed on the door. I photographed everything. I called Marcus before saying a single word to the crew. Marcus called the HOA's attorney. The HOA's attorney claimed, and I want you to appreciate the audacity, that because the water management application was under review, the HOA had reasonable basis to proceed with preliminary infrastructure work. That is not a legal standard. That's a sentence assembled from legal-sounding words to justify ignoring property rights. By noon, I had a temporary restraining order. By 3 in the afternoon, the crew was gone, but 7 fence posts had been cut, and 2 of my oldest apple trees, a winesap and a York Imperial that had been in the ground since 1972, had their root zones disturbed by stakes driven directly into them. One of those trees was dead by spring. 50 years of growth, gone. I filed for damages. The HOA's attorney sent back a letter offering $250. $250 for a tree that had produced fruit for 50 years. That was the moment I stopped defending and started planning. I had a conversation with Marcus that evening that changed everything. I explained what I wanted to accomplish, not merely to win the legal case, but to expose the entire scheme, end the designation application permanently, and ensure Patricia Dalton never had administrative authority to do this to another landowner. Marcus listened, drank his office coffee, and said, "Everything you described is legal. Some of it is quite strategic. One part is extraordinarily strategic. Want to know which part?" I did. He told me about a provision in North Carolina water law that most people have never heard of, but once you understand it, you realize why. When properly applied, it functions less like a legal argument and more like a carefully placed constraint. Here's the provision. Follow carefully because this is where everything turns. Under North Carolina common law, codified in state code, a landowner has the right to alter natural drainage patterns on their own property, including the right to redirect, block, or reroute surface water flows, provided they don't concentrate water onto adjacent property in a way that causes damage beyond what would occur naturally. In plain language, I can manage water on my land however I want, as long as I'm not deliberately flooding my neighbor. Now, here's the second piece. Daniel's drainage analysis had done something even I hadn't fully appreciated when he first presented it. It had precisely modeled where water actually went if my property weren't in the equation. What happened to natural stormwater flow if it couldn't pass through the low point in my pasture? It went sideways. Not literally uphill, water doesn't do that, but the ridge's drainage without the natural outlet through my land backed up and spread laterally. Specifically, it spread toward the lowest point on the other side of the HOA's development. Daniel had modeled this carefully, and what his model showed was this. If the drainage channel Patricia proposed through my orchard were never built, if water were instead redirected using modest earthwork and subsurface drains on my land toward the east, the natural flow would seek the next available outlet. That outlet was a shallow depression along the western boundary of Oakmont Heights common property, running directly through the development's detention pond. A detention pond that, according to the community's own site plan, had been sized for existing drainage patterns, not for redirected flow from an entire ridge. Daniel had flagged this in his analysis quietly, as a footnote. Alternative Route C presents engineering feasibility, though would require HOA to upsize detention infrastructure at significant cost. Patricia had never engaged with that footnote. I had studied it extensively. Marcus explained what this meant legally. If the HOA proceeded with their drainage channel through my orchard without proper easement, they would permanently alter the water regime on my property. But under the water law provision, I, as the property owner, retained the right to redirect flows on my own land at any point, even after a channel was cut, even retroactively. So if they cut a channel through your orchard, Marcus said, choosing words carefully, and you then legally installed drainage infrastructure on your property that redirected flows elsewhere, and that caused backflow into their detention system, Could they sue you? He answered his own question. They could try, but they'd have to prove you acted maliciously rather than exercising legitimate property rights. And if you have documentation showing you installed drainage improvements to protect your agricultural operation, completely valid reason, that defense is extraordinarily strong. He looked at me over his coffee. You'd need licensed contractors, proper permits, every piece of documentation pristine. I said, Daniel's nephew finishes his engineering degree in May. Marcus said, then I'd start getting permits in April. What followed was 4 months of the most methodical work I've ever done, and I've hand-grafted apple trees in February wind, so I understand methodical. The plan had 3 components: legal, physical, financial. On the legal side, Marcus filed civil suit against the HOA for tree damage, the dead York Imperial and the disturbed wine sap, seeking actual damages plus legal fees under state code provisions allowing fee recovery in cases of intentional property interference. He also filed a formal ethics complaint with the county against Assistant Director Robert Hayes, whose "should anticipate accommodating" letter had been written on county letterhead to support a private HOA's application. That letter had no basis in county policy. Hayes had written it as personal favor to someone on the HOA board who'd attended community college with his sister. That complaint didn't move fast, but it put Hayes on record and made him suddenly reluctant to issue further informal endorsements on county stationery. On the physical side, Daniel's nephew, Kevin, who had indeed graduated in May and was working on professional registration, designed a water management system for my lower acreage that was, on its face, exactly what it appeared to be: a series of French drains, a retention swale, and a modest earthen berm, all designed to protect the orchard's root zones from excess saturation during heavy rain events. This was legitimate agricultural drainage improvement. Orchards in North Carolina suffer significant root damage from standing water, and improving subsurface drainage is standard, documented orchard management practice. Kevin designed it to meet every county code requirement. We pulled every permit. We had the system reviewed by the County Agricultural Extension Office, who confirmed it was consistent with best practices for fruit tree cultivation. What the Permits and Extension Office review didn't capture, because they weren't required to, was what Daniel's hydrology model predicted about where redirected water would go downstream. Here's the important part for anyone taking notes. Legitimate property improvements, properly permitted, that happen to have downstream consequences, are legally protected as long as they don't concentrate water in ways that cause unnatural damage. The key word is concentrate. Spreading water back toward its natural secondary outlet is not concentration. On the financial side, I made one additional move, which was Marcus's idea, and which I consider the single most elegant component of the entire plan. I applied for and received designation as Heritage Farm through the North Carolina Department of Agriculture. The Heritage Farm program recognizes family farms in continuous agricultural operation for a century or more. My grandfather bought the land in 1961, which didn't quite reach a century, but my great-grandfather had worked adjacent land from 1919 forward, and Marcus helped document that continuous family agricultural involvement met the program's flexible interpretation. Heritage farm status doesn't provide legal immunity, but it provides something nearly as useful. It makes a farm politically impossible to interfere with. No county board member wants to approve a drainage scheme that harms a heritage farm. No planning official wants that story in the newspaper. I received the Heritage Farm sign in July. I installed it at my driveway entrance, large and green, visible to anyone turning off the county road. I know Patricia drove past it. I know because Ellen, who maintained excellent neighborhood intelligence, told me Patricia had contacted 2 planning board members the week after the sign appeared, asking whether historical designations could be reviewed. They told her that wasn't something that could be requested by a third party. She apparently spent several minutes explaining why they were wrong. They were not wrong. Meanwhile, Kevin and a small excavation crew, working mostly weekends, moving methodically through the lower acreage in August heat, installed the drainage system over about 5 weeks. When finished, the pasture looked better than it had in years. The trees stood on properly drained ground for the first time in a decade. The earthen berm ran along the eastern boundary, subtle and grassy, like it had always been there. Daniel walked the completed system on a Sunday morning in September, checking grades with a hand level, making small sounds of approval. "How long?" I asked. He studied the sky. "Depends on rainfall. Average October in this county, first significant event, I'd say. Within 24 hours of the storm starting, their detention pond hits capacity." He looked at me. "Their lowest elevation homes are in the southeast corner." I already knew which ones. I'd been watching for months. October arrived wet. But before October, Patricia made one more move, the move of someone starting to sense, even without seeing the mechanism, that something had shifted. She began a campaign, not legal, social. It started with a letter distributed to all 58 Oakmont Heights homeowners, written on HOA letterhead, describing what she called a neighboring property dispute that had delayed critical water infrastructure and placed the community's drainage system under increased stress. She characterized my resistance as financially motivated obstruction and implied, without stating directly, that I was holding out for a large easement payment. She didn't mention the trees her crew had damaged, didn't mention Daniel's alternative analysis, didn't mention the ethics complaint against Hayes. That letter was, by local standards, a smear campaign, and it worked briefly. 2 Oakmont residents who occasionally purchased apples at my farm stand stopped coming. One left a negative review on my farm's social media page. A county commissioner's assistant called Marcus to ask delicately whether there was a path to resolution, political language for "please stop making noise." Marcus said there was absolutely a path to resolution. The HOA could compensate me for damaged trees, withdraw their designation application, and engage in legitimate easement negotiation if they still believed drainage improvements were needed. The HOA responded by hiring new legal representation, a firm from Charlotte specializing in HOA disputes with a reputation for running up costs until smaller parties gave up. Their first move was a discovery request, designed, Marcus said, to bury us in paperwork and expense. We responded to every item, fully, on time, with clean documentation, because we had documentation for everything. Every permit, every extension office approval, every survey, every contractor invoice. When you build something legally, paperwork isn't your enemy, it's your best argument. Their second move was more personal. Patricia contacted the State Agricultural Extension Office directly, requesting review of our drainage system, suggesting it might have been installed without proper agricultural justification. The Extension Office reviewed it, confirmed again that it met best practices for orchard management. Their third move was most revealing. They filed for a preliminary injunction to halt any further drainage modifications on my property, which was nonsensical because the system was fully installed and there were no further modifications planned. Marcus argued correctly that the injunction sought to undo permitted improvements to private land based on speculative future harm. The judge denied the injunction in a 12-minute hearing. After that hearing, standing in the courthouse parking lot in thin October sunlight, Marcus said something I've thought about often since. They've spent more on legal fees in the last 2 months than legitimate easement negotiation would have cost. They're not trying to win the water issue anymore. They're trying to punish you for not folding when expected. He was right. And people fighting to punish rather than win make different decisions, worse decisions. They push when they should pull back, make noise when they should stay quiet. They don't spend time checking detention pond capacity in October. 4 days after the injunction was denied, the first significant rain event of fall rolled in off the ridge. It came Thursday evening, the kind of rain that starts quiet, just a whisper on dry leaves, then builds to steady, determined drumming you can feel through a farmhouse floor. I sat on my porch with coffee, watching it come. The pasture, with its new drainage system, shed water cleanly toward the east the way Kevin had designed it. French drains pulled subsurface flow efficiently. The berm deflected sheet flow away from orchard root zones toward the secondary swale angling naturally downhill. Downhill and east, toward the ridge above Oakmont Heights. I didn't sleep well that night, not from guilt. I'd done nothing illegal, nothing improper, nothing that wasn't documented, permitted, and consistent with standard practice. But I'm not a cruel person. I would have been satisfied with the legal victory, the injunction denial, the ethics complaint, the heritage farm sign, the planning board's tabling. I hadn't engineered this outcome with malice, I'd engineered it with accuracy. Those are different things. By Friday morning, the rain was still falling. The call came at 7:22 a.m., not from Patricia, from an Oakmont homeowner named Frank Morrison, whose voice had the tight, controlled quality of someone very angry and also very wet. "Did you do something to the drainage up there?" I said I'd installed water management improvements on my own property with all proper permits, as I was legally entitled to do. He said his backyard was flooded. I said I was sorry to hear that. He said, more slowly, "Did you know this was going to happen?" I paused the exact right amount of time. I knew redirecting water on my property might affect downstream drainage patterns. I documented that concern in the public comment I submitted to the planning board when the HOA tried to designate my land without consent. Long silence. "That comment is public record. I'll send you the reference number." He hung up. I imagine he went and looked it up. By mid-morning, I knew what was happening at Oakmont. Ellen called with updates at 30-minute intervals with the cheerful precision of someone who'd been attending planning meetings for years and felt appropriately vindicated. The detention pond had reached capacity around midnight. By 4 a.m., it had overtopped into the community's drainage swale. By dawn, the swale had channeled water into backyards of 11 homes in the southeast corner. No basements flooded, the development was slab on grade, but patios were submerged. 2 landscaping retaining walls had failed, and the pickleball court, somewhat poetically, was under 4 inches of water. Patricia had been on the phone since 5 a.m. She had called the HOA's Charlotte attorneys, who told her nothing could be done before weekend. She had called the county water office, who told her the Brennan property's drainage improvements had been permitted and reviewed. She had called Preston Mercer's development company, who had a policy of not answering calls before 9 a.m. on Fridays. She had not called me. At 10:17 a.m., she knocked on my door. I'd been expecting this. I opened the door before she finished knocking. She wasn't wearing her lanyard. I noticed that specifically. I'd never seen her without it. Mud on her shoes, polo shirt damp at the shoulders. The clipboard was there, but held flat against her body rather than presented, which wasn't her usual posture. "You did this," she said. "Good morning." "You redirected that water on purpose." "I installed a water management system on my own property with permits to protect my orchard." "You knew what it would do." "I knew what my engineer predicted it might do under certain rainfall conditions. I disclosed that prediction in a public planning comment. Would you like the document number?" Her jaw moved. I could see it, trying to find the angle that would work, the tone that would shake something loose. "Those are people's homes," she said. And for just a moment, the bureaucratic armor dropped, and there was a real person behind it, genuinely distressed, not calculating. I felt something. Not regret. What she'd done to my trees, my grandfather's trees, didn't leave room for regret, but something human. "Yes," I said, "they are. And they never should have been put in a position where their drainage infrastructure was undersized because the developer was counting on routing excess capacity through my private land. The people in those houses didn't make that decision. You did. Preston Mercer did." She stood there in the drizzle. "What do you want?" she said finally. I told her. Full compensation for damaged trees, withdrawal of the designation application, and a legitimate easement negotiation at fair market value if drainage improvements were still desired, with licensed engineer, documented alternatives, and no more informal county letters. She nodded once, barely. "I'll have the attorney call Marcus." She walked back to her car. I watched her go. The rain had slacked to drizzle, and the air smelled like clean, wet clay and the last fall apples, sweet and slightly fermented. The same smell it always carries when things are ending and something else is beginning. I closed the door, made more coffee. The private settlement between me and Patricia might have been the end, except the story had already escaped into the world, and worlds, once alerted to a good story, tend to finish them publicly, whether principals want them to or not. The flooding at Oakmont Heights was covered by Sarah Chen in the Henderson Valley Register. Her story was precise and damaging. She had Daniel's alternative drainage analysis submitted as public planning comment. She had public hearing minutes. She had the ethics complaint against Hayes, recently substantiated in Quiet County Review. Hayes had received written reprimand and been reassigned away from development review, about as dramatic as county administrative discipline gets. She had the injunction denial, the Heritage Farm designation, and she had the flooding photographs. The pickleball court under 4 inches of water, a retaining wall of expensive imported stone collapsed into October mud, a backyard patio with furniture standing in water up to the seat cushions, the detention pond designed for one rainfall regime trying to handle another. Sarah's story ran online Thursday evening, in print Friday morning. By Saturday, it had been shared 1,800 times. By Sunday, picked up by regional outlets. By Monday, a reporter from Raleigh called Marcus. The county commission held emergency session the following Tuesday to discuss water management practices and informal designation procedures. That meeting was technically procedural review. In practice, it was public accounting. Patricia was not on the HOA board when the meeting convened. She'd submitted resignation by email Sunday evening, citing personal reasons and desire to focus on her home. 2 other board members resigned the same day. The board's remaining members hired professional property management to handle HOA administration, what they should have done in 2016 when the community was founded, instead of handing authority to Patricia Dalton. Preston Mercer appeared at the county commission meeting in person, wearing a fleece vest and the expression of someone who'd read the same email chain 40 times. He announced his development company would fund independent engineering review of Oakmont's water infrastructure and commit to implementing identified improvements at the development company's cost, not the HOA's. When commissioners pressed whether that commitment was legally binding, he said yes. When one commissioner asked why his original development plan had sized the detention pond based on drainage route through private land his company didn't own, he said, "That was an oversight in our planning process we take full responsibility for." Oversight is a very polite word for what it was. Robert Hayes was not at the meeting. He had, as noted, been reassigned. I attended, sat in back with Daniel, Ellen, and Marcus. Did not speak during public comment because I'd already said what I needed to say in document form months ago. There's particular satisfaction in watching a public proceeding where every piece of evidence presented was already filed by you in advance in correct format with correct citations. The significant moment, if there was one, came from Arthur Simmons, the retired commissioner, who rose during public comment and said in measured, unhurried voice of someone who remembers when things operated differently, "This entire situation could have been avoided if someone had knocked on Michael Brennan's door, sat at his kitchen table, and talked to him like a neighbor. That's how we used to do things. That's how we should still do them. Law didn't fix this. Common decency, applied late, barely fixed it. Let's remember that." The room was quiet for a moment after he sat. Then people started clapping. Not many, but enough. The settlement was signed in November, 13 months after the harvest event, 2 months after the flood. The HOA, under new professional management, compensated me $11,800 for the 2 damaged trees based on trunk appraisal method called trunk formula technique, which calculates mature tree value based on species, size, condition, and location. That's a real calculation method used by arborists and accepted in court. Trees are worth more than $250. Preston Mercer's company paid for proper easement appraisal and offered $7,200 for limited drainage easement along my property's eastern boundary, the eastern boundary, not through the orchard. Kevin designed the new drainage channel over 5 weeks. It routed water through existing low point, requiring minimal grading, tied into the upsized detention pond, left my apple trees untouched. The York Imperial was still dead. You don't get that back. But the following spring, Kevin helped me plant 2 new trees in its place, a different variety, an Arkansas Black, which is an heirloom apple that tastes like cold autumn air and something you can't quite name. It'll take 10 years to produce meaningful crop. That's fine. My grandfather planted trees he knew he wouldn't see in full production. I can do the same. Water improvements at Oakmont were completed the following summer. The 11 flooded homeowners each received settlement from Mercer's company covering landscape and hardscape repair. The pickleball court was resurfaced. I'm told it's still a source of conflict. Sarah Chen at the Register won a State Press Association award for local reporting. She accepted it graciously and immediately began investigating a separate zoning issue in the next county. I hope she never stops. Daniel Hayes took early retirement in February. I have no particular feelings about that. The ethics review his case went through resulted in the county adopting new policy. Any informal letter of support issued by a county official for a private party's planning application must be approved by the county attorney's office before distribution. That's a small reform, but small reforms, documented and applied consistently, are how large problems get quieter over time. As for the orchard, we had a good year. 10,800 pounds of apples, same as the sign said. The drainage improvements, if I'm honest, actually helped. Lower pasture root zones are healthier than they've been in a decade. Kevin's French drains have kept the soil profile exactly where it should be through wet spring and wet fall. In December, I started something I'd been meaning to do for years, a scholarship. The Thomas Brennan Agricultural Scholarship, in my grandfather's name, awarded annually to a Henderson County student pursuing a degree in agriculture, horticulture, or environmental science. The first award is $1,500, seeded with a portion of the tree settlement, and I've got commitments from 2 local businesses and 1 restaurant owner